When your daughter stops calling, your ex-wife forgets your birthday, and the silence of your home starts echoing louder than traffic, you begin to wonder what it is you're still waking up for. Richard Monroe lit his last cigarette on the balcony of a 3-bedroom house he hadn't furnished in 2 years. It overlooked a street where neighbors he never met walked their dogs past overgrown hedges. He didn't wave. Neither did they. There was no grief in his life. Just a kind of sedimentary numbness that had settled over everything since the divorce, since the layoffs at the hospital, since his daughter Emily moved to Seattle and stopped returning his messages. The silence wasn't cruel, it was indifferent. When the call came about volunteering with the aid convoy near the Iranian border, he said yes before asking where exactly. It wasn't courage. It was momentum. It was either go or fall deeper into the couch and vanish. 12 days later, the dry wind of the Zagros Mountains cut across his cheeks like a blade. The convoy jeep sputtered as it reached the field clinic, one of many temporary outposts scattered like pebbles along the line of conflict. There were no fences here, just dirt, sweat, and the uneasy feeling that at any moment the sky might fall apart. His first days were spent sorting bandages, refilling IVs, assisting in surgeries under the direction of Iranian doctors who spoke quickly, clipped, and never once looked at him with more than professional distance. He wasn't here to lead. He wasn't needed for that. And honestly, that suited him fine. Javad was the exception. A former English literature student who now served as translator, driver, and occasional smuggler of coffee, he stuck close to Richard with a quiet watchfulness. "You are not like the others," he said once, passing him a small metal cup of strong black tea. "You look tired in the bones." "I am," Richard said. And they left it at that. One afternoon, after a strike left a nearby village smoking and silent, Richard followed Javad to help evacuate survivors. The air was acrid with burning straw and something else. Flesh maybe. Or rubber. The sounds that rose from the rubble weren't screams. They were soft, muffled, too weak to cry properly. He found her under a collapsed wall, young, maybe 25. Blood crusted her forehead. She clutched a girl in her arms. The girl was maybe 4, barefoot, one arm twisted unnaturally. They didn't cry. They just looked at him, unblinking. Behind them came another woman, older, dragging a child and muttering prayers under her breath. And another, holding a cooking pot and little else. 3 women, 3 children, and the only surviving men were either boys too young to shave or ghost. They took them back to the clinic. That night Richard couldn't sleep. The tent rustled in the wind like a restless thought. The girl with the twisted arm, her name was Hannah, had taken to following him silently, her eyes like polished stones. When he offered her a protein bar, she turned and ran, only to return the next morning to sit beside him while he worked. The women did not speak unless spoken to. Their names came slowly. Fatimeh, the oldest, maybe in her mid-30s. Nilufar, the one with the cracked lip and sharp eyes. And Layla, younger, gaunt, always watching her sisters for cues before moving. When he asked Javad where their husbands were, the translator's voice lowered. One died in Shiraz protest. One was caught in a drone strike. The youngest, her husband was taken by Pastorin and has not returned. Days passed. The sisters helped in the clinic without being asked. They boiled water, cleaned instruments, kept the children quiet. One night they invited him to eat. Not with words, with gestures. A small blanket on the earth, a bowl of rice with saffron and goat meat, flatbread wrapped in cloth. He took off his boots and sat. He said, "Thank you," in clumsy Farsi. They smiled thinly. It was the first time he saw their teeth. Over time, things softened. The kids laughed more. Hannah let him lift her onto his lap. Richard began to pick up fragments of language. Chai. Dard. Candidan. Pain. Laughter. One evening, after dinner, Fatimeh approached. Her veil was pulled back. There were streaks of gray in her black hair. She sat beside him, not looking at him directly. "You are kind to children," she said through Javad. "And women. Not like soldiers." I'm not a soldier, Richard said. She nodded. Still. You could leave. But you do not. He said nothing. She spoke again, slower. Javad hesitated, then translated. She asks if you would consider a marriage to her and her sisters. Richard blinked. He thought he'd misheard. What? Javad cleared his throat. She says you have no wife. No children here. You treat them well. There is no man left to protect them. It is not for romance. It is for survival. He looked at the sisters. None of them met his eyes. They were not ashamed. But they were not pleading either. It was offered the way you might offer shelter from rain, a practical, necessary thing. I don't think I can do that, he said softly. They would not ask again, Javad replied, equally soft. That night, Richard walked beyond the perimeter of the clinic. The stars in Iran looked different, closer, more insistent. He thought about Emily. She hadn't spoken to him in almost 2 years. When he messaged her that he'd left the country, she responded with a thumbs-up emoji. He thought about the empty house in Oregon, the framed family pictures that were all 10 years old. He thought about how Hannah had leaned into him that afternoon, just a little, just enough to rest her head on his shoulder. The next morning, he asked to speak to Fatime. Javad stood close but didn't interfere. Richard took a breath. I'm not here to save anyone, he said. But I can stay. I can help. Fatime looked at him, really looked at him. Then nodded once. No ceremony followed. No parade. Just a new rhythm. The next day, Nilufar handed him a bundle of washed clothes. Layla pressed dates into his palm. The children no longer stared. They climbed him like furniture. And when he returned to the tent each night, the silence no longer swallowed him. Richard never called it love. But when Hannah began calling him Baba by accident, and no one corrected her, he didn't say a word. The rain had dried up 2 days ago, but the earth still held the memory of it. Thick mud clung to the soles of Richard's boots as he followed Javad up a narrow path. Smoke curled above what was left of the village. There were no bodies in the open. The locals had already carried them away. But the walls told stories. Blackened outlines where fire had kissed too long, bullet holes stitched like scars across stone. A child's toy, burnt at the edges, lay beside an upturned basin. No cries, no moans, just the heavy breath of aftermath. Javad raised his hand. Beneath a collapsed doorway movement. Richard stepped forward and knelt. Shoo. It's okay. You're okay, he murmured, knowing she didn't understand a word. The woman blinked. Her lip was split, blood dried down her cheek. A child was wrapped in her arms, silent and too still. Another woman approached behind her, limping but upright, holding a toddler by the hand. Then a third, barefoot, eyes wide, hair loose, holding an aluminum cooking pot like a shield. 3 women. 3 children. No men. They followed him back to the field hospital, wordless, walking like shadows. That night, Richard sat outside the tent with tea cooling in his hand. The sisters remained huddled inside the supply shelter, having refused the tents. It wasn't modesty. They simply didn't trust anything with flaps. The children clung to them, as if separation might cause the earth to split. The next day, Fatime helped wrap gauze on a boy's thigh. Layla wiped down surgical tools. Nilufar took stock of clean linen and water. No one asked them to, but they didn't stop moving. Each task done without question, as though movement itself was a way to survive. Javad noticed too. They were from a large family. Good reputation. Educated. This life was not meant for them. Richard didn't respond. He watched the way Nilufar peeled potatoes, her fingers quick, deliberate. The way Fatime whispered to the youngest child before bed, singing words Richard couldn't follow but somehow understood. The way Layla stared at the hills each morning, as if waiting for someone who hadn't come home. He asked for their names, and Javad helped. They answered carefully, not shy but guarded. When Richard attempted a greeting in broken Farsi, they smiled, small, uncertain smiles, but not unfriendly. A week passed. The sisters never asked for favors, never spoke of the attack. But every night they laid out a piece of cloth and served a simple meal: lentils, rice, sometimes flatbread and dates if the aid truck arrived. Richard started eating with them. He brought the sugar cubes for tea. It was Fatemeh who spoke first. Javad paused as she finished, uncertain. She says, they cannot go back. Their father is dead. Their village is gone. They cannot survive in the camp much longer. They need protection. Richard nodded, still not understanding where this was going. She says they talked among themselves. They think maybe you would stay. As their husband. His mouth went dry. Not in the Western way, Javad added quickly. They know you are not Muslim. They do not ask for faith. Only safety. A name. You are kind. Their children are not yours, but you treat them as if they were. I can't. I don't even know them, Richard said, his voice cracking. Javad gave a slight shrug. They are not asking for romance. This is not about love. He stood and walked away, leaving Richard alone with the weight of what had been said. That night the storm returned. Lightning cut the sky. The children whimpered in their sleep, clutching their mothers. Richard lay in his cot, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the wind slap the canvas. He remembered his daughter's first asthma attack. The way she had clung to him. How that look of trust broke something in him wide open. Emily hadn't spoken to him since he missed her graduation. Work had held him. Always something urgent, but never something as urgent as this. In the morning, he approached Fatemeh. She stood by a washbasin, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, water dripping from her hands. He spoke without translation. I'm not here to save anyone. But I won't leave. She looked at him, eyes level. Then nodded. Things changed slowly, not dramatically. The sisters didn't touch him. There were no ceremonies. But they let him carry water now. Let him patch the roof of the supply shelter. The children stopped flinching when he entered. Hannah climbed into his lap with a book and pretended to read. When he reached for his tea, she pushed her cup toward his lips. He learned how to say it's okay, thank you, wait, and enough. He asked Javad for more. He practiced with the children, who giggled and corrected him. One afternoon, Nilufar pressed a piece of paper into his hand. It was a list, dates, times, and a word scribbled again and again. Hamla attack. She writes the strikes, Javad explained. She memorizes the timing. Pattern recognition. Her husband was like this too. They buried half of him last year. Richard folded the paper. Nilufar watched him with unreadable eyes. 3 days later, an old man from the village came with a cleric. A modest contract was written. No vows, no spectacle. Fatemeh signed for herself. Then Layla. Then Nilufar. Richard printed his name last. He felt nothing. That night, he washed dishes while the sisters bathed the children. He cut his finger. When Layla saw the blood, she took his hand and wrapped it in gauze before he could reach for the kit. No infection, she said in halting English. He smiled, not because it was funny, but because her voice sounded like home after weeks of silence. Later, Fatemeh brought him bread still warm from the pan. She didn't speak. He didn't need her to. Javad approached him the next morning. You're different now, he said, pouring Richard tea. Am I? You walk like you don't want to leave. Richard stirred the sugar slowly. Maybe I don't. That evening, he sat with the children by the fire. Hannah pointed to the sky. Setara, she said. Star. He repeated it, mouth clumsy. She laughed, then leaned into his shoulder. He didn't move. He let her stay. The wind carried the scent of ash and cumin through the courtyard as Richard watched the children chase each other in loose circles. Dust kicked up from their bare feet, their laughter a fragile defiance against everything broken. He stood at the doorway with a basket of herbs in his hand, unsure if he was intruding or arriving. It had been weeks since the ink dried on the marriage contract, and still, he woke each morning uncertain of what role he played in the lives unfolding around him. There had been no dramatic shift, no revelation. Only routines. The quiet rhythm of necessity. He fetched water. He helped mend tools. He sat on the steps with Fatime as she picked through lentils, separating the good from the spoiled. Nilufar no longer looked away when speaking. Layla began humming again while she cooked. It was in these simple repetitions that Richard began to forget the sharp edges of his old life. The sterile corridors of the hospital, the stale coffee, the way his ex-wife's voice had grown clipped with time. The quiet judgment of being replaced, not violently, but indifferently. In this village, no one asked who he used to be. They only asked what he could carry today. When the first storm of the season came, it tore away part of the clinic's canvas roof. Richard stood on a ladder, rain drenching his back as he hammered it down with makeshift nails. Below, the sisters held the ladder steady. He caught Layla laughing when he cursed under his breath in English, her face soft in a way he hadn't seen before. That night, they ate in silence by the fire, their clothes still damp. No one complained. The days blended into each other, some filled with small victories. Teaching Hannah how to count to 10 in English, repairing a torn shoe, guiding a birth without complications. Others came with grief. An elderly man died from untreated pneumonia. The aid trucks missed their delivery by 5 days. One of the village boys stepped on a buried mine just past the ridge. Richard had helped collect what remained. He didn't speak during the burial. Later, he sat by the irrigation ditch, wiping blood from his sleeves. Nilufar found him there. She didn't say a word, only handed him a cloth and poured water over his hands. Her fingers lingered, just briefly, before she turned and walked away. It was small, that touch. But something shifted. Not in heat or romance, just in weight. He was no longer just the outsider with kind eyes. He was someone they had chosen to share burden with. Not obligation. Continuation. The village had been rebuilding slowly. After the last drone passed, the men began digging trenches around the fields, placing rusted metal sheets as makeshift barriers. Richard helped where he could, his body sore in ways it hadn't been since his 20s. Javad had gone to the city for supplies and hadn't returned. Rumors spread, checkpoints tightened, arrests common. His absence was felt like a missing limb. In the evenings, the family sat by lantern light, listening to the radio static that sometimes broke into state propaganda or poetry readings. Layla hummed lullabies to the children. Fatime read verses aloud. Richard took to writing in a small notebook, trying to piece together a vocabulary he couldn't yet speak fluently but had begun to feel. One morning, Nilufar collapsed in the garden. Richard caught her before her head hit the stones. The children froze, watching silently as he carried her inside. Her breath came short, her skin pale. He laid her down, pressing fingers against her wrist, counting. Layla knelt beside him, whispering rapidly. He couldn't follow. Fatime brought water, her hands shaking. Javad's absence had left them without proper medicine. Richard did what he could. Monitored her pulse. Adjusted her bedding. Sat by her side as the fever broke in waves. By the third day she spoke. "Back he," she murmured. "Child." Fatime translated only with her eyes. The pregnancy hadn't been planned, but it hadn't been unexpected. It was a remnant of a past not yet buried. And now, it was tethered to the present in a way none of them could ignore. Richard stood outside the room that night, staring at the moon. It looked the same as it did in Oregon. But here, it didn't judge him. Didn't ask why he stayed or what he had left behind. When Nilufar recovered enough to sit up, she asked for him. Through Fatime, she said he could leave if it was too much. That she didn't want to trap him in something he hadn't chosen. Richard answered without pause. "I'm already here. That's enough." He began building a cradle. Not because anyone asked, but because his hands needed to do something more than dress wounds. Fatime brought him wood from a dismantled barn. Layla sanded it smooth. The children painted its sides with colors mixed from dirt, ash, and beet juice. It wasn't perfect. It rocked unevenly. but it was theirs. The neighbors began to visit more often. An old widow brought jam made from bitter oranges. A boy with one hand helped string laundry lines between homes. Richard taught a group of teenagers how to splint a wrist using sticks and cloth. They called him doctor in jest, but with respect. Spring approached with hesitant warmth. The first flowers poked through the rubble. Almond trees bloomed in ghost-white clusters. The courtyard became a place of light again. One afternoon, Richard found himself alone in the garden with Layla. She pointed to the vines climbing the side of the shelter. "Sabs mishaven't," she said. "They turn green." He nodded. "Like starting over." She smiled and reached for his hand. He let her hold it. The baby came early. Nilufar screamed into the night as Fatimeh and Layla worked beside her. Richard boiled water, brought cloth, did whatever he was told. When the cry finally came, sharp, insistent, alive, it cut through the darkness like a promise. A girl. Tiny. Wrinkled. Strong. Nilufar cradled her, tears streaming down her face. She looked up at Richard and said one word. Omid. Hope. He didn't correct her. He didn't say he wasn't the father. He only knelt beside them and whispered the name back. The first sound was not the baby's cry but the sudden, urgent silence of the women. Then came the wet gasp of breath, a tiny protest of new life that made the room exhale. Richard leaned against the doorway, his hands still slick with the boiled water he'd carried in minutes before. Nilufar held the child to her chest with both hands, her face unreadable. Not joy. Not fear. Just stillness, as if she were waiting for something to go wrong. But the child was alive. Pink. Breathing. A girl. He didn't move forward. Just watched. Fatimeh placed a cloth over the infant's back. Layla, still catching her breath, met his eyes and nodded once. Not approval. Not permission. Just recognition. He had been part of this now. Outside, the morning light spilled over the courtyard like honey. Dust danced in its beams, and the almond trees trembled with birds Richard still didn't know the names of. The old cradle he had built rocked gently with the wind, though it would remain empty for a few more days. Nilufar refused to place the baby down. Not yet. The villagers began to arrive by noon. They came slowly, carrying dried fruit, old swaddling blankets, bread wrapped in cloth, jars of rosewater. No one spoke of the birth directly. They came to acknowledge that life, despite everything, had insisted on continuing. An old man placed a sprig of mint on the doorstep. A woman in black pressed a coin into Richard's palm and touched her chest. He didn't understand the custom, but he nodded. By evening, the courtyard was full. Someone played a cracked flute. Children darted between legs, the smallest ones climbing the low stone wall that bordered the garden. Fatimeh moved through them with a plate of rice and lentils, offering food to every hand. Richard found himself seated between two farmers, neither of whom spoke English. They smiled anyway. He offered his cup. They clinked it with theirs. The fire in the center crackled and spat. It reminded him of camping trips he used to take with his brother before their mother died. Before the family fractured in all directions. The celebration didn't erase anything. The war still rumbled in the distance. The roads were still unsafe. The sky was never free of drones. But for one night they sat together under stars and ate until the plates were empty. Days passed. Then weeks. Richard's hands hardened from labor. He learned how to gut a fish using a knife sharpened on a river stone. He helped rebuild a wall near the clinic, mixing mud with his boot. He discovered that Layla could recite entire poems from memory, her voice steady, almost bored, as she fed the children. He asked Javad to return with books. Anything with pictures. He wanted to learn faster. He wanted to speak to the women without translation. He wanted the words to belong to him now. He spoke to his daughter again, finally. Not because he expected forgiveness, but because there was too much unsaid. He stood by the well when the connection held, her voice distant and thinner than he remembered. She told him she was pregnant. Due in August. Her husband was kind. She didn't ask where he was, only how he was. When he tried to explain the child Nilufar had given birth to, Emily grew quiet. "That's not your child, Dad." "No," he said. "But she calls me Baba anyway." His daughter said nothing for a long time. Then, "I'm glad you're helping people." He didn't know if it was a goodbye or a beginning. One afternoon, a boy named Reza ran into the courtyard with blood on his shirt. His brother had fallen while foraging near the edge of the mined road. Richard ran without asking questions. The boy's leg was broken, but he would live. Still, the reality returned with bite. The quiet could vanish in a breath. The peace was never permanent. Later, Fatime stood by the field's edge, her hands dusted with soil from the carrots she had pulled. She looked at Richard without smiling. "You will leave one day," she said in broken English. "I don't know," he answered honestly. She nodded. "If you go, leave something good." He thought of the trees, the ones still bare, planted 2 months before. He thought of Omid, now smiling in her sleep. He thought of the villagers asking for help with letters to missing sons. Of the way Layla had begun asking him questions about Oregon, about snow. "I'm trying to," he said. He started teaching the children letters. Drew them in the dirt with sticks. A was for apple. B for bird. They laughed when he couldn't draw straight. Hannah insisted on drawing hearts instead. The older ones began copying his handwriting. They didn't care what the words meant, only that they could write something and make it last. Richard built shelves from old doors, fixed broken windows with scrap metal, repainted a wall with the children, blues, greens, purples. They didn't stay within the lines. He didn't ask them to. Javad returned in late spring. Thinner. Quiet. He brought news. Sanctions tightening, checkpoints multiplying, cities on edge. The world outside hadn't stopped breaking. If anything, it had begun to accelerate. But the village was still holding on. The aid trucks had changed routes. Resources were tighter. But still, they came. Javad sat with Richard that evening, sipping tea near the garden. "You've built something here," he said. "I'm just filling in the cracks. Sometimes the cracks become the shape." Richard nodded. He looked over at the children playing in the dust, at Layla peeling onions, at Nilufar swaying Omid to sleep, at Fatime crushing spices with a stone. It wasn't the life he expected, but it was the one he had become necessary to. The next morning, he planted another almond tree. He placed a photo beneath its roots before covering it with soil, a faded image of a younger version of himself, standing beside his ex-wife and a wide-eyed Emily. He didn't bury it to forget, only to let something new grow from what had once mattered. When he stepped back, dirt on his hands, the smallest boy in the village tugged at his sleeve. "Name." Richard looked down. "You want to name it?" The boy nodded. "Omid," Richard said. "Like the baby." The boy grinned and ran off. Richard turned toward the sun and followed the sound of children's voices, knowing some things might not last, but they mattered anyway.